Hey, thank you very much, Rick. Would you join me in a round of applause for Rick and the entire Hamvention team for organizing this? I think it's going to bring a lot of healing to this country to see groups get together again in a way that's safe and allow us to try to regain some normalcy to what's been the modern day equivalent of a plague. And so anyway, there are also a few others in the audience who are in healthcare. And if you're in healthcare, I know we have a nurse here who also has a nice Flex Radio shirt on, and two nurses actually. If you could stand, if you're in healthcare, I want to give you a round of applause for all you've done. Dr. Marks, I think, is watching on live stream. If not, he's going to call me and I'll let him listen by phone. I met Peter March of 2020 when this started happening. And he is head of the section at FDA, or the division at FDA, that oversaw and still oversees all of the new therapies and vaccines for COVID. And he is still busy. He was working 16 hours a day plus when we worked together 7 days a week. I think he's down to 5.5 or 6 days a week now, but he's still putting in long hours. And he couldn't come this week because they have a lot of new data they're looking at. You'll be seeing a lot in the news in the next few weeks about COVID, potentially new therapeutics, new approaches. And if you ask Peter about where he sees the direction going with therapeutics, he will share a lot with you. So ask those questions today. And, Peter is not live on the phone now, so I'm going to say this. Peter Marks is one of those great American heroes. I know his entire team at FDA brought out Operation Warp Speed. But if they hadn't brought their approach to all of this, our first vaccines would be available maybe this coming December. And so I'm grateful as a person, as a citizen, for myself, my family, and all of you, that we could have vaccines, all of us who wanted them. So Peter, thank you. Well, yes. Yeah, and his call sign is Alpha Bravo 3 X-Ray Charlie. And Peter may tell you this, but he largely operates Maritime Mobile in the Chesapeake Bay. He's got a sailing boat. That's how he relaxes. He's got an ICOM 7100. And he's told me about some contacts on sideband with Hotel Zulu in Saudi Arabia and all kinds of DX. So he's a real ham as well. I'm also, I'm a cardiologist by trade, by profession. I also do medical research, and I'm a ham as well. I've been a ham for 45 years this past week. So coming to Hamvention this week was my 45th celebration of being a ham radio operator. Many of you are longer licensed than me, I know that. And I've also been editor of the National Contest Journal. And I was editor during the first part of the pandemic, and that was really a crazy time. So I want to talk today, and Peter will too, about the impact of how we as ham radio hobbyists brought our unique perspectives to crafting some solutions for COVID. First, I want to tell you about the largest study in the world to date on COVID that involved 105,000 people in the United States. I was asked to be part of it in March of 2020, and the concept is that before we had any therapies, right, before we had monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, oral medications, we had nothing. And we knew that COVID was going to wreak a lot of havoc. About 2 or 3% of people would die. A lot more would be in the intensive care unit in hospitals, and you've witnessed this. So we thought of an approach that would take the immunity from anyone who has recovered from COVID and then transfuse the immune factors in something called plasma, convalescent plasma. When you donate blood, your blood is split into blood products and plasma, and the plasma has a lot of immune factors, and we wanted to test whether it would be helpful. And this is the concept. You take a survivor of a disease, once they recover, they have neutralizing antibodies, you inject it, and then hopefully you help people who are critically ill. And this has been historically used for 100 years, and I'm going to show you some data on that right now. If we go back to maybe 1890, 1900 was the first time that physicians were doing this. It's been tested on and off. And then there was a Wall Street Journal editorial on February 27th, 2020 by a physician at Johns Hopkins, Arturo Casavidal, who talked about how convalescent plasma may help with this disease. And this Wall Street Journal editorial stimulated a colleague of mine at Mayo Clinic to start talking with me, because I was chairing our research ethics committee about doing this. And it turned out that by mid to late March 2020, the Food and Drug Administration was getting 5, 10, 20 requests a day for emergency authorizations of convalescent plasma. And you can imagine when they were trying to regulate the diagnostic testing and look at the research models for the vaccines and the research models for the oral drugs and the potential monoclonals, that their staff was just overwhelmed. They were working night and day, and I mean that. You think, you know, people go into government work for an easy job, easy life. It's not true. They were working harder than anyone I've ever seen in the private sector. And a number of hospitals started using what we call an emergency use application, convalescent plasma. And so the FDA asked for a single protocol to test this across the United States, and we were contacted about using our protocol because Dr. Michael Joyner, a good friend and colleague, had asked for my advice. I've done clinical trials for 20 years on creating a protocol that he could use. And so I gave him a lot of criticism about, and that's what we do in medicine. We never do that in ham radio. No one ever criticizes a company's radio products, right? But so we do this as well in medicine. And I said, Mike, are you open to some suggestions that might not be that might be hard? He said, yeah. So I gave him a lot of suggestions, and he eventually said the FDA would like to talk with us about doing the study. So I was asked by our leadership at Mayo Clinic to work with Mike, and we brought a whole team together of volunteers. We stood up a whole section of volunteers in 2 weeks to do this. And on April 1st of 2020, we were given FDA approval, and then we had regulatory approval or ethics approval at Mayo Clinic to start this. And the whole thought was that we could do this study and maybe enroll 5,000 people. And that was the goal. And remember that, 5,000 people. And we were able to get the first patient transfused on April 6th. Now, think about this. There weren't really many blood banks collecting plasma from recovered COVID survivors by April 6th because it was still burgeoning largely in the Northeast. And the blood centers were like, we don't want to bring infected people in and infect our non-infected cancer patients and other patients who are immune suppressed. So a very small number of hospitals, including Mayo Clinic, set up collections. And by August 31st, we had seen this. So we had 2,700 hospitals and critical care facilities across the United States, including all of the military outposts globally, who were doing the study. The VA approved the study, the DoD approved the study, and you can see on the right where the plasma was collected and where it was given. And it looks like an airline flight map, doesn't it? But that was the story of this, and there's a real lesson in that as well. If you ask me about what lesson I learned from that, I'll talk about that. And when we finished this study of 5,000 patients, it turned out to be 105,707. And if we had known how big it was going to be when we started, we might have passed on the opportunity, but we didn't, because we felt it was our duty as physicians and as Americans to be a part of the solution rather than a part of the panic of COVID. And there's a whole team at Mayo Clinic. Our CEO gave me carte blanche for a month to recruit physicians, to recruit scientists, to recruit IT workers. We were furloughing people right and left, like every hospital, because we had to stop surgeries because we didn't have enough masks and gowns, right? And so I was able to call friends and colleagues and say, can you join us? Will you walk with us for 3 weeks? Will you help us? And we put together an amazing data team. And I'm speaking about it, but there are 100 people behind me who really made this happen. And at the end of all of this, it was the collaboration between our group, the Hopkins group, who gave us a lot of intellectual support, and the blood bank community, and the FDA and Peter Marks. We were weekly on calls with Peter, and sometimes every day, and his leadership was really incredible. We published a subset of this study in the New England Journal in January of 2021. The study was considered an open treatment study, but what most physicians failed to realize was that it was a pragmatic randomized trial within an open treatment study, because we were giving plasma, but we didn't know if it had lots of antibodies against COVID or a few antibodies against COVID. But we were collecting the samples, and once we had the assays developed by June, we could then determine who got the high potency, high octane plasma, and who got the low potency plasma. And so we were able to compare and contrast. And when you enroll 105,000 people, a lot of the variables that a randomization scheme take care of work their way out as well. And we showed a reduction in mortality, or I have to officially say an association of a decline in mortality of about 20% there between the low titer and the high titer plasma. which we thought was remarkable. And I think more importantly than what we demonstrated, it was the backbone of then some clinical trials that came on and finally showed in a randomized smaller trial of 1,000 or 2,000 people that giving this in the outpatient setting really made a big difference at delaying hospitalization, eliminating being in the hospital, and lowering risk of death. And I think Dr. Marks will talk about how this was the scientific foundation for proving the vaccines would work and the monoclonals will work. So thank goodness we had this therapy early on, and thank goodness better drugs and techniques came along as a consequence of the initial science that we did. So that's kind of what this study accomplished. These are the other studies that have shown that. What we found was that high titer plasma really worked. And if you look carefully at the press conference from President Trump in August of 2020, and then the FDA decision a week or two later to approve this, the high titer plasma, the stuff that we found worked, is what was approved. But how did we get there? I mean, what tools did we use, and how in the world did ham radio help? So that's going to be the interesting part for you, I think, right now. Number one, no one told us we couldn't accomplish this. When I look at my friend Gerald Youngblood in the audience, who has brought SDR, the concept of SDR, to ham radio, I've heard Gerald say on podcasts, he had no idea it would become so prolific so fast. But we all now own SDRs. Whatever brand you buy, it's what Gerald started. And that's what happens when you're curious as a ham. Amazing things happen. And we actually had to home brew some solutions, and Dr. Marks is going to talk about that. Anybody see this in QST a few years ago? This is an article by my friend Tom Schiller showing you could actually radiate a signal off a light bulb. Now we knew that, right? How many of you as novices practiced your CW in a dummy load before the license came and got notified that you were being received by a ham down the street or 5 miles away? Yeah, right? So we knew that anything will radiate, right? And now with FTH you can probably get DXCC with a light bulb, right? Given that technique. So we repurposed a team, as I've said, and we were lucky, I was lucky, and we were lucky to work at an organization where teamwork and collaboration is the norm, rather than an individual group of kingdoms. We all work together. And so we had a very decentralized management structure, and I credit our leader, Dr. Joyner, for that. And this is basically like a good field day team. I mean, field day is not a single person entity, is it? It's a team of people in a decentralized manner. And like I said, the culture at Mayo Clinic promotes teamwork and collaboration. I'm really not trying to sell you to come to Mayo Clinic, but it is a great place. All right. Well, the second challenge we had was, where was the convalescent plasma? We were ready to go. I kid you not. I said this the other night at dinner with a few friends. I remember the first week getting a phone call from one of my physician navigators, a colleague of mine, and he said, "You've got to talk to a hospital in Louisiana." And so I called them. And a nurse talked to me, and she said, "We have a 60-year-old internist," or something like an internist, "who is on a ventilator, and he's been in practice here 35 years. We love him. We're afraid he's going to die. We can't get plasma. Can you get us plasma?" And I said, "We are working on it night and day." I had calls from North Carolina, all where the COVID outbreak was occurring. And we weren't in a panic mode, but we were thinking of every way possible. I remember being on a special conference call with the Secretary of HHS, and Dr. Marks was there and others, about how could we get more donors. And I gave them a good idea, but they didn't want to do it, which was to bring all the former presidents, Bush, Carter, Obama, and do a public service announcement, you know, try to depoliticize it. But instead they went with a tweet from a number of people in the administration. And, well, we got some donors, but I'll give you the secret about how we got the donors, okay? Plato reminded us that necessity is the mother of innovation, right, or things. So how do we find these? How do we get a hold of them? Well, we got on and we called CQ donors. And what do I mean by that, okay? And I want to thank Bob Heil. Bob, are you here? Anybody from Ham Nation here? This turned out to be one of our best publicity things. Mayo Public Affairs followed all. Mike Joyner did 100+ interviews with media. I did about 30 or 40. Others did a bunch. I didn't keep track, but Ham Nation was one of our really best watched, most observed. And Bob had me on twice in April, where I was calling and asking people to donate. And there you can see a picture of me at the bottom bottom left of the screen. The third lesson, like anything with ham radio, is that help comes from a lot of places. And you need to just be open for the idea, right? And so work with people who volunteer to help you. You know, I would never have a rotating tower at my house if I hadn't asked friends and had 20 people come and help me put it up. I want to introduce you to a gentleman. This guy is from New Jersey. His office is in New York. His name is Chaim Leibovitz. Chaim and a large member of his Jewish community were infected early on with COVID. And Chaim called us after he had recovered, and he said, what can we do to help? And we said, we need donors. And he said, I'll bring 100 people from my synagogue to donate. And so he contacted the New York Center Blood Bank, and they declined because they didn't know how to safely draw the blood. And so Chaim then started talking with us about chartering jets to fly them all to Rochester, Minnesota to donate. So we called the blood bank, and it was Mike Joyner who had all the connections. And the New York City Blood Bank said, if we have 100 donors, we'll figure out a way. So they went to the community in the suburbs of New York, and they lined up and they donated. And Chaim, being a shoe wholesaler, brought a whole new perspective to recruiting and selling. It was amazing. He came up with these hats, COVID plasma donator, stickers. You don't see the next slide. This is a bus. This is in South Florida. He chartered 3 donation buses and went up the coast of Florida, up and down the coast to get donors when the pandemic was in Florida. And he helped recruit a lot of donors. And he now actually works directly with some of the senior leadership in FDA to get monoclonals to patients at their home. He's got a distributorship in New York to connect people who are sick with nurses who can come and give them monoclonals. He's really gotten turned on to healthcare and renovating healthcare, innovating it to get away from the old ways that we do things. So Rick, I'm pretty excited to watch what Chaim's going to do. But, you know, like with any field day, there's always the senior person, the godfather, right, or the godmother who knows everything. They can tell you, well, we put the hex beam there 5 years ago, but it blew over. Put it around the corner where the wind gusts aren't so bad. Well, this is Dr. Arturo Casadevall. Arturo has spent his entire career researching and working on convalescent plasma, and he was the author of the Wall Street Journal article. He has a great life story. He escaped from Cuba as a preteen. His family said to him, we're leaving. The communists are not going to be good for any of us, and they fled to the United States. And he told me over and over that our study could only have been done in the United States because of the openness we are and the fact that we have this can-do, will-do attitude. And you know, I felt great as an American that the culture that we live in gets criticized so much globally, but we actually, I think, have some of the secret sauce for innovation in this country. And I was proud to work with him on the study. Turned out that Arturo had been turned down for 2 promotions at outside institutions. One he actually declined because after he talked to them, he said, you really need someone with a different skill set. And he told me later, he said, the fact that I decided to stay at Johns Hopkins gave me the bandwidth to help you guys with this study. And he has written incessantly papers and talks and worked with guidelines to bring this therapy now out into the forefront. And ham radio lesson 5 is it helps to have a couple of ham operators in leadership with the study. And this is a photo of our next speaker, Dr. Peter Marks. And I've told you about Dr. Marks. Well, the study idea, he has a great background. He's worked as an academic physician at Harvard and Yale and in New York City. He's worked in the private sector. He worked with one of the big pharma companies for a few years, and then FDA recruited him to be director of the Center for Biological Therapies. And he's also, as I said, AB3, X-Ray Charlie, who does a lot of sailing and ham radio operating. And then, of course, there was me. Let's see, wrong slide. Okay. Well, what were the contributions? Well, I think as a group of hams, we can innovate, improvise, overcome, and adapt. And that's what we did. You know, we're persistent. If something doesn't work, we'll keep trying, won't we? If we can't get the antenna to work, we'll tweak it, or we'll fix it, or we'll come up with a new design. And we learn how to network. We're really good at networking, whether it's a net on 75 meters, and by the way, I don't go on 75 nets with my call sign, because suddenly people talk about healthcare, you know. But we network, right? And YouTube, all kinds of YouTube things now, all kinds of great learning things. And finally, we're curious people. You know, we will call CQDX or CQ 20 meters or 10 meters just because we want to talk to someone. And I think the curiosity we share with medical researchers. This is a slide I showed last night. I think sometimes my patients think that when I put on my stethoscope, I may start saying CQDX here. Well, I want to close with 5 minutes to give you some hope and to help you walk through a little bit of what happened with COVID and from my perspective. And I collected a lot of these photographs and slides in 2020 because I knew I would forget by now, because that's human nature. When we go through trauma, we try not to remember. So let's talk about the remarkable progress we've made with COVID. In December 31st, the People's Republic of China had announced that the WHO that they had an unrecognized viral pneumonia. Now later publications, and this was in the Wall Street Journal, maybe 10, 12 days before that, this was identified by one of the labs in Shanghai. And by January 11th, the genetic sequence of this was out, and the government of China shared it with us, shared it with the world. I know there's been a lot of criticism of China, but I actually give them credit for sharing the genetic code so we could experiment and develop therapies and vaccines. In January 13th, Thailand reported cases, so that's when we knew that the horse had escaped the barn. And then on January 22nd, there was evidence of human-to-human transmission when physicians started recognizing that physicians were dying. And then by mid-March, Europe had become the epicenter of the pandemic. In mid-February, I was on an airplane flight from Riyadh to Minneapolis, and with a layover in London, and I was reading the latest publications, and that's when it hit me that we were in for something we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And that was sobering. And I was in Newark, New Jersey, in Parsippany, New Jersey, a few days before March 11th, and I checked into the hotel, and the guy at the front desk said, "I got you on room 2. He said, "It's pretty good. The people with COVID are up on room 3. I stayed one night and left. I flew back home. That's all the time I needed for the work I was doing there. So, by April 4th, we had 1 million cases globally. And then I like to say the United States reacted or acted. And that's when Dr. Marks and his team started Operation Warp Speed. And we started doing diagnostic testing. They started rolling out studies with remdesivir, with vaccines, and the convalescent plasma study. But we also remember COVID as the day that the music stopped. Remember how the world shut down with COVID? One of my physicians in training, we call them fellows, asked me in February when I got home from Riyadh what I thought we should do, and I said if we really want to stop it, we should close air travel immediately. I said, but that may be a price that's too high to pay. And she said, no, we can't do that. How many weeks later did that happen? Mike Joyner has a rule of thumb. If you know you need to do something, do it quickly. Don't wait. I'm not much of a businessman, but he seems to have it. Peter Marks shared with us early on in the study that we needed to be prepared to give plasma to tent hospitals. This is an example of a tent ICU in Central Park in New York. And let me tell you when the medical community knew how serious COVID was, okay? Now this is a sobering slide, so I apologize if it triggers or offends anyone. When the trucks to take caskets and bodies from the hospital started lining up in the parking lots in New York hospital parking lots because they lacked cemetery sites, we knew it was serious. And then I think our friends in Africa realized the world had stopped when the Wild Kingdom guys here, the lions, came out on the highways and started sleeping during the day because there was no automobile traffic. This is a really honest-to-goodness press report from Kenya. Isn't that interesting or sobering? It's just amazing. I think we're in a better place now. We have vaccines. If you take them, I've had 4 of them. I'll take another one anytime. I think we know that masking really limits transmissions. You'll see me masking a lot here because I don't think this thing is done yet. We have widespread tests. Any of you have at-home tests like I do? Yeah, it's a good idea if you're worried. We have new therapies and treatments. I hate to say, but 1 million people have died in the United States either from COVID or in association with COVID. And now we're seeing a mental health crisis from it. But we have something that a lot of countries don't. I saw a patient from Singapore a few months ago, and I said, how are things going? He said, you don't realize how lucky you have it here. I said, what do you mean? He said, look, I'm in Singapore. He said, I have an app on my phone. He said, when I leave my apartment or condo, I have to scan a barcode at the door, and they track me. And he said, when I come back from the U.S., I have to quarantine for 10 days, and the police come by several times a day. And he said, when I stopped traveling to China because they quarantined me for 21 days, 2 separate hotels, to make sure I don't bring it in. He said, you guys can travel or fly from state to state, even though you're not traveling globally much. From state, this was late last year, he told me, you're lucky. And he was right. We did. We were able to travel and do things. So we figured out how to mitigate this. And now the music plays, thankfully. Well, that's my side of this whole thing. And now I'm going to bring Dr. Marks on. So let's see if we can reach him. Let's see. What do we have here? All right. We'll get him on, and then I'm going to let him speak. So he's going to talk a little bit as well. So how do I adjust this? Hello, Peter. Okay.
We're in good shape here too. So I think Scott on the finishing up here.
I'm just going to make sure the audience can hear you. I've got the voice max. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Raise your hand if you can hear it, Peter. Yeah, they can hear you. You're 5'9" here, Peter. How many QSL cards do you need? We're good on that. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
So thanks so much. And Scott's very humble. He was really a linchpin member of a team that helped get the initial therapeutic of convalescent plasma to be available. There were so many roadblocks at the time, and Scott was able, with his very pragmatic way and really very calm way, kind of a typical ham, kind of just working the problem to solve a lot of issues that would have otherwise prevented the convalescent plasma from moving forward. And that was really the only therapeutic we had for quite some time. So Scott really can't say enough fantastic things about him. So thank you, Scott. And thanks to all for coming and listening today. I'm going to say really three major issues that I think that the response to COVID-19 has in common with ham radio, and really the first of them will be about circuits, the second will be about homebrew, and the third will be about communication in general. So the key insight that came around Operation Warp Speed was one that really was a circuit problem. And it had to do with the fact that normally in most of the things we do in medical product development, we use serial circuits because it turns out that they tend to cost the less than other things, the least. So we normally proceed, and just to make that analogy, normally, for instance, in vaccine development, one goes from one stage of development, finishes that one, then goes to the next, and then goes to the next. And when one is developing a vaccine, one doesn't start to manufacture it until one has gotten through all of those stages. And that's a serial way of doing things. But the insight for Operation Warp Speed was that you could do things in parallel, and in doing so, not sacrifice anything in terms of the quality, safety, or effectiveness of the products that one was generating at the end of the day. And so that transition from serial to parallel processing is what the insight that led us to have millions of doses of vaccine available right after the initial effectiveness was shown. And just the example there was that while the clinical trials were going on to show that the vaccines actually worked, the manufacturers were making millions and millions of doses. Now, if the clinical trials would not have come out positive, those would have had to be thrown away. But that was a cheap price given the number of lives that were being lost. So by manufacturing at risk in parallel, when we finally had the vaccines available, they were able to be available because when safety and efficacy was demonstrated, because that parallel process meant that when we authorized them, within 2 days, they could be shipped. Normally, that process, it really would have been another year. And so that insight of parallel processing really helped. Now, there were some other things that helped shorten that, and I'll get to that in a second. The other thing that's really, I think, was really important about the response, and this goes to something that Scott was talking about. This was about homebrew, which is that ultimately, when we talk maybe in the questions and answers about where we have to head with the vaccines, we might be talking about about manufacturing new rigs commercially. But when we started out the response to Operation Warp Speed, in Operation Warp Speed, a lot of what we did was homebrew. We weren't really buying anything new off the shelf. In other words, we weren't taking fundamentally new concepts. What we were doing was using what we had around the shack to put together a response. And so it wasn't that there was any brilliant new piece of equipment or brilliant discovery. What it really was taking what we had available, the tuna can and a few transistors, resistors, and a circuit board, and soldering them together so that they could produce a signal. And that's what was done here. There was nothing fundamentally that was a dramatic new discovery. And in fact, we used technologies that were tried and tested. And although it's true that the mRNA vaccines, this is the first time that they've been widely deployed. They've been in development for 10 years before they were brought forward as part of Operation Warp Speed. So that was the homebrew piece. But ultimately, the thing that made the biggest difference in moving forward Operation Warp Speed was constant communication. And normally when we do drug development, we have very, the communication between the federal government and the FDA and the people who make the products is very formal. It happens in formal meetings that have formal timelines after a meeting request of when the actual meeting happens. We broke that all down for Operation Warp Speed. And what ended up happening was we had constant communication. And in fact, we kind of prided ourselves on the fact that we became the dry cleaners of communication with industry. That is, they would get us questions at 9 and we'd get them answers by 5. In by 9, out by 5. And that is the truth, the absolute truth. And sometimes it was even faster than that. It was like taking your suit at lunch after you got mustard on your jacket and they'd clean it right on the spot. We would try to do that as well. So we really used things that are close to us as hams to make this work. And the community that came together for this really was like the ham radio community, which is that I think that some of the best of this country showed itself, which is hams don't look to their own glory. I think we all work together in the network, and it's not like someone's out there, we have contests, but at the end of the day, it's more about everyone participating, and it's about the contest itself and less about the person. And this is what I think the beautiful thing about Operation Warp Speed is it really showed what we are capable of as a country when we forget about our own credit and really want to do things together in support of an objective. So I am kind of grateful for all of the help of everyone that worked together on this, because it was a wonderful thing to be a part of, and it really did have a lot in common with what we do best in radio. And again, we changed over from serial to parallel circuits. We homebrewed as much as we can, and we continue to do some homebrewing, by the way. And communication was really key. And communication on all different bands as necessary. So with that, I'm going to stop and just thank you all, and thank Scott in particular for letting me be a part of this.
What questions do you all have for Dr. Wright or for Dr. Marks?
I'm going to repeat the question, and I'm going to let Dr. Marks answer. The question is, what's going on with mucosal vaccines? And repeat the second part. Are they really sterilized? Sterilizing. What do you mean?
Yeah, no, great. Wow. That's somebody. That's a level 601 graduate level question. Thank you for that.
That's John Langdon, N5CQ, who lives close to Lake Wobegon because he's really above average.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to step back one moment so that everyone can understand the question a little bit better. One of the problems with our current vaccines are really important, and everyone should get boosted. Everyone should make sure they're up to date on the vaccination. But we know they're really not the final stopping place for what a good COVID-19 vaccine is. And that's because although they're very good right now at giving us short-term protection against symptomatic disease and long-term protection against severe disease, they don't prevent transmission of the disease. And to do that, we believe we will need a vaccine that provides good mucosal immunity. What mucosal immunity means is that it's basically means that our bodies are able to wipe out the virus where it enters, as opposed to waiting till it can get a toehold, and that means it also has more of a chance of transmitting. There are a number of promising programs going on now for mucosal vaccines, and unfortunately they won't be ready probably to have us have boosters in this coming fall, but my hope is that by fall of 23 we'll see those come along for the 23-24 season, because those have the potential. Some of them that are being developed may be able to give us long-lasting immunity that actually kills off the virus rather than just protects us. You see, there's a difference between preventing an individual from getting serious illness and both doing that and preventing further spread. That's what we want, and that's what those mucosal vaccines will hopefully get to. But they're still probably a year off till we see them hopefully start to come into commercial availability, or even into much broader wide-scale testing. Over.
Thanks, Peter. Go ahead, Rick.
Other questions? Yes. So I hear your question, and I know that Dr. Wright has an answer to it, because I know that he just answered it. You heard it okay?
I did. The question is, the person is grateful, Peter, for the fourth vaccine, second booster, but the fall, will there be recommendations for an additional booster or potentially new types of vaccines? And I know you have an answer for us.
Yeah, I know. That's another great question. So, nobody should worry about not getting a fourth dose right now, because it will not prevent you from getting an updated COVID-19 vaccine in the fall. We will be having a very lively discussion at the end of June, be a public discussion at our vaccines advisory committee meeting about the optimal booster to give people in the fall to prevent what could be another wave of COVID-19. And what that composition will be will probably be it's much the same way we do for flu vaccine. It's what we predict will give us the best protection about what may come along next. It's never perfect, but it may involve, again, we don't know for sure right now because that's open for discussion, but it may involve helping to give us some protection against Omicron, the current circulating variants, along with kind of strengthening our general protection against other coronaviruses that might come along. So it might be an updated version of the vaccine, but really an important message here is that updated version will be able to be given to people who end up getting a fourth dose right now in order to help prevent COVID right now during this current wave. Over.
Dr. Wright, have you had your fourth vaccine?
I had my fourth vaccine in March.
Dr. Marks, have you had your fourth vaccine?
I had my fourth vaccine on April 7th.
And I have two. So thanks very much. Yes.
What's the status of the non-mRNA vaccine?
Yeah.
Second question is, are there any
So these are two really good questions, and the first question is really the answer he just gave. What's the status of the non-RNA vaccines? So I'm going to let Peter answer that. And then are there additional oral therapies besides the current one that's approved? So Peter, would you mind maybe talking about the protein-based vaccines and the non-RNA-based vaccines for the fall, and then where we are with oral or IV therapies, and where you think there may be some applications to your agency, so we might have something new in the fall?
Yeah. So let me start with there are other non-mRNA-based vaccines coming along. One which is will be going to advisory committee soon, which is a protein-based vaccine by the company Novavax. There's another company that will likely come along in the not too distant future as well with a protein-based vaccine. That's Sanofi. So that will give additional options for non-mRNA vaccines. There already is one non-mRNA vaccine available. That's the one by Janssen. But there will likely also be other non-mRNA vaccines coming up along behind, including ones that are they're called viral-like particles. They're not live viruses, but they mimic the virus. Produced using recombinant technologies. And so those will also come along. There are also in the background people that are trying to make live virus vaccines that could potentially help in one dose give broad protection against COVID-19, and we'll have to see where those go as well. Now, in terms of therapeutics, really good question. What is coming along? There are several therapies, and I unfortunately I can't go into details of things that are under investigation or drug application at the agency, but I can say that there are several therapies coming along, which the place where we see one of the real medical needs is things that can treat people with more severe COVID-19, because that's actually been a real challenge. The current drug, Paxlovid, particularly if you start taking it very shortly after you're diagnosed, is pretty good at making sure that people don't get severe COVID-19. And there are some, you'll hear some back and forth, I'm sure, in the media about whether it should be really 5 days or should be 10 days. The current labeling is for 5 days, but there'll be some back and forth about that, I'm sure. But these newer drugs that are in development are trying to reduce the mortality that occurs when people get severe COVID-19, and that's been really challenging. So we'll hopefully, I see there are some. What I can say is there are some promising data there, but the real hope is that we will have simpler versions too of the drug Paxlovid that should make things easier. In other words, additional drugs like that in our armamentarium to use against COVID-19. Over.
Thank you, Peter.
On this side, yes.
If one's had, say, Pfizer vaccine and you're getting your next one, is there any immune response to if you get Moderna? Would that be better, or stick with the
So the question is, if you get an mRNA vaccine from Pfizer, should you get a booster from Moderna? And what I can tell you, I can answer this one, it's a simple, easy question, is they both work really well. There might be a 1 or 2% advantage for crossing them or taking a little heterogeneity, but I think just get what's available, right? I've had 4 Pfizer shots, knowing that maybe if I'd taken 1 Moderna, I might have had a little more of a boost, but the boost you get is, it's like saying, is it better to lower the SWR from 1.2 to 1.1 with 4 more hours of pruning, or should you get on and work the rare DX? I know the answer, and you do too. Is that fair to say, Peter?
You are spot on. Thank you, Scott.
Yes.
It's not necessarily vaccine related. Any further figuring out what is causing hypercoagulability or that hyperviscosity? Is that strictly COVID driven, or do we see it more with people that receive vaccines?
Yeah, the question really is a great question from one of our nurses in the audience. Says, you know, a lot of patients get blood clots. I have a ham friend who had a pulmonary embolism, who had been vaccinated but had COVID at the same time he was hospitalized and had PE with it. And I said, I think this is related to your COVID, and what causes that hypercoagulation and those, I mean, it's not in every patient, it's in a small percent. If you'll give me your email address after the session, I'll send you a review article. It's really a complex topic, but I have access to a great paper on it. But I don't think we know fully about it. But Peter, what are your thoughts? I think it's probably related to the infection, not the vaccine, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no. This is one of the really interesting things about COVID is that it seems to cause endothelial injury. So the lining of our blood vessels is a very delicate balance because it basically has to do 2 things. It has to make sure that blood doesn't stick in spots, and at the same time, if there's injury at a spot, it has to be ready to prevent that injury from leaving you bleeding to death. And that delicate balance seems to be perturbed by COVID-19. The virus, SARS coronavirus 2, seems to lead to a tendency to injure that and cause a derangement in that normal balance, so that there are a remarkably high number of blood clots that occur. As well as other things that are very interesting. We don't really understand, for instance, why there's so much injury to the heart muscle that can occur with COVID-19. So it is probably, again, one of these things of the virus injuring or causing an imbalance in kind of normal systems. And Scott, you're probably better off in this than I am, because I'm just a lowly hematologist on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. No, you're not a lowly hematologist, but I just want to say, if you're worried about having a heart side effect or any side effect from the vaccine, you are 10 to 1,000 times more likely to have the same side effect from having the disease. So it's not like it's safe to not vaccinate versus vaccinate. There's a risk. I often say to patients, are you going to jump off this 30-foot cliff onto rocks or this 40-foot cliff into shark-infested water? We got to pick. We can't stay where we are. And so choosing whether you vaccinate or not, if you catch the disease, you're going to get a lot of these complications at a much higher rate than if you potentially get them with the vaccine. And we're just not seeing a lot of this with vaccine, but there are side effects. Let's be frank, there are side effects, but they're not as scary or as common as you might be led to believe by the media, because they want to tell a story. They want to report new things. They're not blowing it out of proportion. That's what they do. So you talk to your physicians, and if you have COVID and you are going to do some traveling, especially across the oceans, talk with them about whether you should take medicine to prevent any of these clots. Just have a discussion with your physician. I'm not going to give you advice except to talk to your physician. Rick, I'll let you moderate. We have about 12 more questions. I don't know, when do we end?
Scott, unfortunately, we have about 5 minutes to get as many questions in as we can. Then we need to wrap up. But let me see. Then let's take one more from this side. Go ahead.
I think since Mexico released my phone is now for Omicron. And I think it's probably going to be because people look at Mexico as this the drug interaction is long. And which ones from the clinical experience in the real world are ones that we're seeing not just.
Are you talking about the oral therapies? Yeah, I think your physician, I assume. Yeah, we have a physician saying he's getting a lot of phone calls, Peter, about drug-drug interactions between Paxlovid and other medications. And is there any oral therapy, in your experience as a regulator, sorry to put you on the spot, that offers the least number of side effects, or is that a question that you need access to some databases to sort of formally answer?
Yeah, no, the problem here is that the drug that has many fewer drug-drug interactions is a much less effective drug. So the Merck drug that is for COVID-19, that is an antiviral, which has really fallen out of favor because it's only about 30% effective, it doesn't have the same kind of drug-drug interactions. For Paxlovid, there are enough drug-drug interactions that oftentimes one just has to think about whether somebody can do without. The good news, it's only 5 days. So many medications we can do without for 5 days. And so one just has to get online, and there's actually tools to see, because Paxlovid is actually a combination of two drugs. One is one that's been around for a while, ritonavir, in addition, and so that is what leads to some of these drug-drug interactions. So hopefully, with future generations of these drugs, we will not have. That's one of the things that developers are looking to do, is to have things that do not cause as many drug-drug interactions, because obviously a lot of these are being given to people that are older who are already on multiple medications, and that does create a problem. But the way I think we've, again, this is not medical advice, but it's just something to, an approach to this is to make sure when prescribing it, you get online, look at the drug-drug interactions, and in some cases, people can do without another medication for 5 days while they're taking Paxlovid.
Okay,
I think we're going to do one more question here.
One more. Go ahead.
What do we know about why people with mild cases have long COVID? What do we know about long COVID?
So the question, it's a great question from Bob Wilson, who's a scientist here and an engineer. What do we know about long COVID? Do we know, are there common risks? I've been asked this question a half a dozen times during the Hamvention. We recognize it's an issue. Peter, do you have any thoughts? And I'll give you the final word, because I will tell you that what I know, there's a large set of studies being funded. We still don't know the true reasons, but we see it with a lot of viral illnesses, not just SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, so first of all, there's some data starting to come out about long COVID that it does look like one of the concerns that might, and we don't know if this is all of long COVID, but it does look like in some people, the virus is able to hang out, or at least genetic material from the virus is able to hang out in macrophages for a period of time. There are probably other issues going on as well. And so we're still starting to learn a lot more about what's going on here with long COVID. Long COVID, to me at least, because we don't have a lot of time, it is one of the areas that we are going to have to spend a lot more time studying, because I think we may have underestimated the burden that we will have in the future from this, because we see some pretty serious neurologic issues and sometimes some pretty serious cardiologic issues that occur afterwards. So the NIH is spending a lot of money. I think it's about $1.5 billion in the next year or two to look into this more, because it's so important to try to figure things out.
Well, Peter, we'll... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say I think we're about out of time. I see people coming in for the next one. Listen, we appreciate all you do and the long hours you work, and your team at FDA. Give them our appreciation. Let's give the FDA a round of applause. So please share that with your team, Peter, and have a great rest of the Saturday.
And I want to thank you for everything that you have done, and thank everyone, and hope everyone stays safe and enjoys the airwaves.
Thank you. 73.
Great questions from the audience. Thanks very much. And have a great day.